you who missed it, the session was recorded and can be found on the Friends website, sterlingfriends.org, in the social feed section, which is towards the bottom of the website, and we'll also be recording this session. As you know, we count on membership dues, and they're as low as $10 a year. That's a year. And we count on donations to fund high quality library programs at the Sterling Road Library, which the Hollywood Fort Lauderdale community has enjoyed for many years. Now with the use of Zoom, however, we are finding participants from the entire South Florida area and even beyond. To find out more about upcoming programs, as well as how you can support the Friends, please view the website. Again, it's sterlingfriends.org. This presentation will be about 45 minutes with questions and answers following the presentation. You can go ahead and enter them in the chat at the end of the presentation, your questions, and I'll read them to Dr. Watson. I recommend that you switch to the active speaker view during the session. And please note that any political views expressed are not necessarily the opinion of the library or Friends. Try to stay away from it, but it's really hard. Our speaker, Dr. Watson, is an award-winning author, historian, visiting scholar, political commentator, and community leader who currently serves as Distinguished Professor of American History and Director of Project Civitas at Lynn University in Boca. Dr. Watson is the recipient of many awards for his contributions to the study of the presidency, election commentary, community service, and civics programs. Among his honors are an athletic scholarship to Virginia Tech, where he played football and ran track. Also, he received the Independent Publisher Book Award and the Professor of the Year at both Lynn and Florida Atlantic Universities. As viewers discovered last week, Robert Watson makes history interesting and fun. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Watson. And I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. I appreciate it. And thank you to the Friends of the Sterling Road Library. You heard Rhonda give a little pitch there. So I encourage you all to join the library. Libraries are more important now than ever. We need to reinvigorate reading. Of course, and those of you that know me, and let me say hi to Karen and Richard and Wendy and Andy. Those of you that know me and listen to me speak all the time, first off, I apologize that you do. But secondly, you all know that I have said for several years now that the #1 issue facing us as a nation is incivility. I think we really need to restore a sense of decency, decorum, and a sense of community. And libraries can do that. It's a place where people can come together and share ideas, books, and what's better than getting together with friends over literature. That's hard to beat. So let me encourage everybody to join the Friends and to support your local library, and in particular the Sterling Road Library. And when this darn virus is behind us, I will come down there in person and we'll celebrate books and then celebrate over a good drink.
Sounds good.
The thing that's better than just books and friends. So, all right. Last week there was one thing I wanted to get to. I had a couple people ask me about, and I promised a story on Betty Ford, since we talked about First Ladies. And my Betty Ford story ties nicely into today's topic of mistresses and affairs and misbehavior in the White House. So it's a good transition. So I've always liked Betty Ford. I had a chance to interview her by phone many years ago, and several other First Ladies. And I've always felt that one of the things that we owe a great deal of gratitude to Betty Ford for was the same thing that she got hammered for within her own political party. And that was Betty Ford came out publicly and spoke very openly and frankly about breast cancer. And there were preachers and the state legislatures in Texas and Alabama and Tennessee who censured her and complained that she shouldn't talk about this. This was the first time the word breast was said in a network in prime time. And so many years ago, I went to the Ford Museum Ford Library and did a little research project. And the letters flooded in, just condemning Betty Ford for using the word breast and talking about breast cancer. But what was interesting is a few months later, the letters flooded in of a different tone. And they were like this. Dear Mrs. Ford, my mother heard your speech and was brave enough to get tested for breast cancer. She had it and she's alive today because of you. Dear Betty, I heard your speech. I went and got tested. I'm alive because he, and I tell you, the letters made you cry. They were really empowering. So I've always admired that Betty Ford was so frank and open in those conversations. I always liked her. So a couple of years ago, the Ford Library and Museum was celebrating what would have been Jerry's 100th birthday, I guess it was. And they invited me to be a keynoter. So obviously somebody there made a grave mistake. And the event was hosted by Barbara and Laura Bush. So I got to meet the Bush ladies and have lunch with them. And the whole time I'm sitting there thinking, I hope to hell they haven't read my book on the First Ladies, because I wasn't very complimentary of them. But apparently they didn't read it. But it was also the Ford kids, Stephen and Susan, and the Ford kids were there. So I had talked about Betty Ford's life and how I thought she was like Harry Truman. She had honor, she was open and direct. And after the event, we're having lunch, and Susan Ford is a lovely woman. I really enjoyed her company. She's drinking, I'm drinking, we're all drinking, and Susan is missing her parents, and she's sad from hearing all this talk of her parents, and she's had too much to drink. And after a while, she leans over and she says, Robert, can I call you Robert? And she's like, grab me by the arm. And I go, yeah, of course. And she goes, I'm going to tell you something. And I go, okay. And she goes, but you got to promise me you'll never tell anyone. So of course I've told everybody I know since then, right? So I go, yeah, sure. And she says, well, I thought you captured my mother perfectly. And she cried. She said she was a wonderful woman. And I said, Susan, I've always held your mother in highest regard. She says, so after Nixon left the White House and Gerald Ford came in, there's a custom in the White House where the incoming first family always gets a tour, and they have the whole White House staff there, and they walk them through the building. This is the chef, this is the butler, this is the usher, this is the maitre d', and there's 100 and some rooms and multiple elevators and everything in the building. So she said, we go upstairs, and it's a solemn occasion because Nixon left under a cloud of scandal, of course. So everybody's kind of on their best behavior and nervous and doesn't know what to say. And that's not Betty Ford, who is a real person. They get upstairs and they're walking. And what I should say is most first families, first couples, have not shared the same bedroom. The first president and first lady to share a bedroom in the White House were the Eisenhowers. And as Mamie said, Ike had so many different military postings. She said, it's the longest time we've ever lived in one place, so I wanted him with me. And then, of course, Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, for obvious reasons, had separate bedrooms, which we'll talk about in a moment. But Betty, so they get upstairs, they go to the bedroom, they say, Mr. President, this is your bedroom. And then down on the end of the hallway, Mrs. President. And Susan says to me, she goes, my mother stepped up and said, now listen to me. And she told all the White House staffers walking around, Jerry and I are sharing one bedroom. And when we're in there, don't come a knocking. And then she goes, boop, and she pops Jerry Ford on the butt. And Susan said everybody was like stone-faced. They didn't know what to do. And then it was a great icebreaker, and everybody had a much-needed laugh. And they realized the Fords were regular people, and Betty Ford was beloved by the staff. And Jerry Ford was beet red in the face because he was kind of starched. So there's my Jerry Ford and Betty Ford story for you. So with that, I'm going to share screen, and I put a PowerPoint together. Oh, Rhonda, could you enable the share screen for me? I guess make me a host or share screen, and then I put some juicy pictures together for you. So I think if you go to me and make me a co-host, I should be able to share. Let's see. Yeah, that should work. Let me try it. Ready? 3, 2, 1, boom. There we go. Technology. Okay. So thank you, Rhonda. So with that, here's our talk about affairs of state. So this is not my typical book. It's my only book that is R or R plus rated. And I got the idea many years ago. I was at the Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, and I was doing some work there. And I don't know if I said it or not last week, but whenever I go to do research at a museum or a library or a presidential home or battlefield, wherever it is I go, you spend a little time doing research, but then I always ask the staff, I always give them a fun question, something like, what's your favorite story about this person? Do you have a story that made you cry? Story that made you laugh? You know, to try to get some good stuff so I can share these stories with all of you. And as Rhonda suggested, try to make history come to life. So I'm sitting for hours reading on Washington, going through manuscripts and his letters. And finally, I get up and I walk over to the archivist and I came up with my question. I said, by the way, do you have any teenage love letters from George Washington? And the archivist, she looked at me and she went, I've never heard that one before. Hang on a minute. So I went back to my work, and later on she came back and she said, I talked to the staff. I don't think we've ever heard that question. And I said, perfect, let's do it. So we dug up and we found, we looked up and we found a couple teenage love letters from George Washington. So as best as we can tell, George went 0 for 10 as a teenager trying to court women. Oh, George! You know, not the George that we know from history, right? The monument, the man, the myth. George went 0 for 10. How did this big, he was well over 6 foot tall, which, you know, he was about 6'2", which today is a little taller than average. Back then, it would make him Shaquille O'Neal. He was a big guy. How did this big, strapping, ambitious teenager strike out all the time? Here's why. George would show up at these leading homes of Tidewater aristocracy with holes in his pants, a half-dead mule, and a bad case of acne, a very bad case of acne. And he tried to court older, wealthy women, which was a topic that we discussed a little bit last week. So he was looking for those South Florida cougars, man. So George went 0 for 10. He wrote that at one house, the servant got the father, and the father comes to the door and says, quote unquote, Mike, from last week, the quotes are verbatim. I always try to memorize quotes. The father says to George, the servant got the father comes to the door, tells teenage George, quote unquote, my daughter is a star out of thy orbit. And then slammed the door in Washington's face. Washington went home and wrote that he was unlucky at love. And he composed a rather lame roses are red, violets are blue poem. And he ends it with the line, my poor wounded heart, it's been shot through by Cupid's dart. Oh, gee wash. So George tried to court older women. So I'm at the library and I'm reading all these letters that George was unlucky at love. And the other thing I was looking at when I was there was I was a big fan of the late Cokie Roberts. I thought she was a great reporter and a good historian. Always liked her work. But she made a mistake in her book about the founding mothers. She said that Martha went to George's winter camp during the Revolutionary War. 2 winners of the war. Every winner. No question. We have records. Every winner of the war. Now, that may not sound very impressive, but this is quite a feat through hundreds of miles of, in an open carriage. But here's the purpose. What did Martha do? And I alluded to Martha last week. Martha, she sewed socks, mended uniforms, cooked soup for the army, held the hands of dying soldiers. She mothered the army. But she did something else when she was in camp. And this is what gave me the idea to write this book. So among my heroes are Alexander Hamilton, Ulysses Grant, and Harry Truman. And one of the reasons I like those 3 is they're all incapable of lying. The 3 of them are so honest, kind of like our current president. They're incapable of lying. And remember, the comments are solely mine, not the friends of the Sterling Road Library. So those 3 So what I like about reading Grant, reading Truman, and reading Hamilton, which I read a lot, is they call it the way they see it. I mean, they don't pull punches. You get the facts. So Hamilton was a good source of mine for understanding what Martha did in camp every winter of the war. And this is what Hamilton writes when Martha shows up at camp during the war. Hamilton writes, quote unquote, "Thank goodness Lady Washington has arrived in camp. The good general has been inconsolable. Now we can get down to the matter of winning the war." And I'm going, what? Now that Martha's in camp, they can win the war? Was Martha SEAL Team 6? You know, how did Martha win the war? And what it was this: George was gloomy, in a funk. He was not himself. You know, the army was losing. They weren't fed. He was worried. There were calls for his removal. George was depressed. Martha shows up and she imbues him with confidence, and George is George again. And I started thinking about it, and I thought, you know what? I'll be darned. They had sex. And then I thought, am I allowed to say that about George Washington? Will I be disbanded from the fraternity of historians? Will they throw me out? And I thought, you know what? No, I need to write a book about it because nobody's done that. So this is the book that came out from that. So let me forward it for you. Oops, wait, it's not forwarding. Oh, yeah, now it is. Okay, there we go. All right. So here's what I found out during research for this book. I found out that a lot of presidents misbehaved. Bill Clinton wasn't the first, and Bill Clinton wasn't the worst. In fact, some of the presidents were so bad that I don't know, Bill may or may not make my top 5 of the worst dogs in the White House. That's saying something. Here's what I found. Even Abraham Lincoln, I know, right? I can see you. You're going, say it isn't so, Dr. Watson. Say it isn't so. Even Lincoln. So this is a photo of this is one of the earliest known photos of Lincoln. And Lincoln, it appears, visited a prostitute before he got married. So that means it's okay then. It was before his marriage. Visiting professional women back then, I should say, was a lot more common than it is today. So today there's more of a social stigma, interestingly enough. So the story is as follows. Lincoln grew up, as you know, in Kentucky, moved to Indiana, moved to Illinois, and never had any money until later in life. When Lincoln's a young man, he doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together. He's traveling, he moves into a town, and he goes to the general store. And back then, the general store would be like a Walmart today. It sold everything from furniture to seed, to flour, to saddles, to boots, to tea. So Lincoln goes to this general store, and the owner of the store is Joshua Speed. If that name sounds familiar, Speed would become Lincoln's best friend. And they always called one another from then on by their last names, Lincoln and Speed. So Lincoln gets all this stuff, takes it up to the counter, and says to Speed, there's something I neglected to tell you. I'm going to need all this on credit. I don't have any money. And Speed would write down and say in his letter that Lincoln had the most honest and the saddest face he'd ever seen. So he said, okay. And Lincoln would then work off the credit and then some. And as Lincoln's carrying, everything out of the store, Speed says to him, he says, quote unquote, Lincoln, have you even got a place to stay? So Lincoln either shakes his head no or says no. Speed doesn't say. But in the letter, Speed says that Lincoln walks up the steps. Speed has a little 1-room studio above the family store. And Speed says, you can stay with me for a while until you get your feet under yourself. So Lincoln walks up to the room, comes down a few seconds later without anything in his hands and announces, quote unquote, well, Speed, I'm all moved in, which is cute. A little while later, Speed is doing business with a professional woman, a practitioner of the world's oldest occupation, which was not agriculture, by the way, Rhonda, wasn't agriculture. There was something else back there. So Speed's doing business. So you can imagine Lincoln either A, sitting in the bedroom with a pillow over his head, or B, he went down to the general store. We don't know. But Speed finishes doing business, and then Lincoln sees Speed, and Lincoln says to him, according to Speed's letter, Lincoln says, Speed, I've got to have a woman. It's been forever. So Speed says, you could have her. She's a professional. So only Lincoln would do this. This is my cute prostitution story. You thought there wasn't such a thing. Are you ready? Lincoln asks Speed for a letter of introduction. Armed with an old-fashioned letter. He's Lincoln, he's Honest Abe. Lincoln goes to see the prostitute. She's charging $5, which is a lot of money. That would be like what Elliot Spitzer put on his credit card, if you remember that one. It's not $130,000 that Michael Cohen paid for Trump, for Stormy. But it's $5 is a lot of money. Lincoln says to her, ma'am, I don't have it. So she says, how about $3? He says, ma'am, I can pay you back, but it's going to take quite a while. I'm that broke. So the woman writes a letter to Speed, and this is what she said. She said the same dang thing that Speed said. She said it was the saddest, most honest face she'd ever seen. So she told Lincoln, this one's on the house. She said Lincoln sat there nervous for a moment and ran out the door. So there, it's a good story, right? So I would love, 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 love to have been a fly on the wall back at Speed's place when Speed says, hey, Lincoln, how was it? And he said, I got afraid and ran away. So there's my Abraham Lincoln story. If you look at all the presidents who misbehaved, the one that comes in second place, the penultimate dog, would be Lyndon Johnson. Here he is, and two LBJ stories for you. One is the name Jumbo, and that is one of, historians tape oral histories. That is like a Shoah Foundation, right? Like we tape for Holocaust survivors or World War II vets. I've taped a lot of interviews with former aides to Harry Truman, as well as a few for Eisenhower. So if you go to the presidential libraries, there's this fantastic resource. Once again, thank you, libraries. And they have all these oral history interviews that historians have taped with aides that work for the president. There's some of my favorite stories are in the Johnson Library, and some of the ones that made me sick to my stomach are in the Johnson Library. So here's one of each. So one aide says that one day LBJ is in the bathroom. He's at the urinal, and the aide walks in to go to the bathroom, and Johnson starts talking to the aide. And while he's talking to the aide, he's looking down between his own legs, talking to himself, saying, you were amazing last night. Man, oh man. Wait till you see what I have for you this weekend. And then he tells the aide about how his presidential member is so impressive. And then the aide's trying to mind his own business. Johnson turns around and flashes the aide and says, let me introduce you to Jumbo. The second story is Rhonda, I apologize. This is R-rated. So I'd like to announce to the friends of the Sterling Library that this will probably be my last lecture ever for the Sterling Road Library. So all presidents, as you know, have retreats, and most presidents work doggedly when they go to their presidential retreat. Some of them golf. So Johnson, like most presidents, he would go to his ranch in Texas, but it was a working ranch. He took his aides with him, he took a secretary with him, and so on. Whenever Johnson went back to the ranch, he always took one secretary, but he would take one from the secretarial pool, usually in her early 20s. You know where I'm going with this. Before Johnson built a guest house, he had 6 rooms upstairs in his home. And 2 of Johnson's aides go back there with him, and they taped an oral history interview, and this is what they said. In the middle of the night, they heard the unmistakable heavy sounds of LBJ coming up the steps. The aides were in the first room when you came up the steps. The secretary was in the 6th room at the end of the hallway, which was the room that did not have a lock on the door. So now you know. They said they heard the unmistakable sound of LBJ coming up the steps. Why? He was very heavy-footed. LBJ was 6'2", 6'3", well over 200 pounds, big guy. So very heavy footing. Also, LBJ was gross. He was one of those guys who did all those phlegmy coughs, those hacking, snorting, blow his nose in the air. I'm not one of those guys. He was one of those hacking, phlegming. LBJ was also, for the gentlemen that may be in our audience, let me say, he was an enthusiastic scratcher and rearranger. So So they hear the scratching, harumphing, snorting thing coming up the steps. LBJ goes down the hallway. They heard the door open and they heard him go in the room. So the aides got out of the room and they run down to the end of the hallway to listen. Wouldn't you? It's the president. I would. And then I'd write a book about it. And then I'd tell Rhonda about it. So they run down to the end of the hallway. They hear Johnson say just one thing, quote unquote. He says, "Move over. This is your president speaking." Now, as a feminist, I don't know whether to cry or to laugh about this, but then they hear the bed spring, the press, heavy body sitting in. Then they hear, the headboard hitting the wall. When the headboard stops, they go running down the hallway and go back into their room. They said to their horror, a moment later, they hear their doorknob turning and they thought, oh my goodness, the president heard us, in the hallway. So they tried to pretend that they were asleep. And they opened the door and they said LBJ was standing there in a white t-shirt and nothing else. He walks in, sits down on the bed and starts talking about Texas, politics, the ranch, whatever, just shooting the breeze. After a while, he gets up and goes down the steps. And the two aides said that was surreal. They said the next day they realized why he stopped at their room. They're out at the pool and Johnson's out there with the secretary, the young woman, and the aides are sitting in lounge chairs, and Lady Bird Johnson comes out and she's carrying a serving tray of drinks. So she walks up to the two aides looking at them like I'm looking at all of you with the drinks, but she's talking to Lyndon, who's behind her with the secretary. So she holds the drinks out and she says, quote unquote, "Lyndon, were you upstairs last night?" But she's looking at the aides. So the aides said, we didn't know what to say. We couldn't say yes because we'd be ratting out the president, but we couldn't say no because we'd be lying to the first lady. So they said, we just went, they didn't know what to do. But they said then from behind Lady Bird, Johnson bails himself out. He says, quote unquote, "Of course I was upstairs last night, Bird. I was up there shooting the breeze with the fellas. Wasn't I, fellas?" And they go, yeah. So now they knew why he stopped. It was his alibi. So when they get back to Washington, they couldn't wait to tell all the other aides this disgusting story. And as soon as they started telling the story, they said, all the other aides said, hold on, wait a minute. Let me guess. You guys were in the first room in the hallway. The secretary was in the sixth room. He stopped at you. So in other words, they all knew the same story. So it wasn't just LBJ's alibi. It was his MO. Ben Franklin wasn't a president, but maybe the greatest living American. He certainly has my vote for that. Some people say he was America's Leonardo da Vinci. I usually correct those people and remind them that Leonardo was Italy's Ben Franklin. Franklin was a remarkable man, a polymath, a Renaissance man, just extraordinary. But one of the things I like about Ben is he was raunchy and funny and real and self-made, by the way, just like Hamilton, Grant, and Lincoln, and Truman. He was the 10th of 16 kids to an uneducated Boston candle maker. Wow. Here's two quick Ben stories for you, both involving raunchy misbehavior, okay? All right, so number one, when Ben was a little boy, because his family was so poor and he was something like the 10th kid, Ben had no hope. The oldest kid might get something, but all the rest were apprenticed off. So Ben is sent to work for his older brother, James. So he's about between 8 and 13, 14, and he's working at James's printing company. They ran a newspaper. Now, back then, as we all remember from when we were younger, every city had multiple newspapers. Today, we're losing newspapers. We have social media accounts, right? So Ben's helping James with the newspaper. What's amazing is even though Ben's a little kid, he is reinventing the printing industry. So one of the things the Franklin brothers did was they printed letters to the paper, which people loved to read what other people said. So one day the Franklin brothers go out and they open the doors to the printing press, and there someone at night slid under the door a letter. And it was from an older society woman named Silence Dogood. And she's obviously writing in a pen name. And Silence Dogood's letter is really something. She talks about her family came from upper echelons in England. They were crossing the Atlantic on a ship. The ship gets sacked by pirates. Her parents get killed. The lead pirate takes her as his mistress. She manages to escape. You know, I mean, this is a heck of a story. So Ben says to James, we have to print this letter. James says, I can't print this. It's too salacious. Remember, everybody, this is puritanical New England in the early 1700s. Ben says, you got to print it. James eventually says, okay, we'll print it. And of course, you know the response. People can't get enough of this thing. They love the letter. So a few days later, James and Ben open up the printing press, and there's another letter that had been slid under the door. Another Silence Dogood letter. This one's even better. It talks about which men are sleeping with which women in society, who's having affairs, right? It talks about which ladies gain the most weight, who got a lousy haircut, whose dress didn't look good. You know, I mean, it's really spilling the beans. It's like the Entertainment Tonight channel today, right? Or Fox News, one of those. So James says, we can't print this. Ben says, we've got to print it. And so, of course, eventually James prints it. And what do you think the response was? People loved it, loved it. So James, nobody knows who Silence Dogood is. All of Boston is, you know, gossiping. So James stays up one night hiding in the bushes outside the printing press. To his horror, guess who he sees? Little Ben sliding the letter under the door. Ben Franklin is Silence Dogood as a little kid. Now, here's the thing. How does a little uneducated, untraveled little boy speak with the social sophistication of women in society, right? You know, I'm a very youthful 58, but, you know, if I go to a party, you know, friends or my wife, after the party, they're always saying to me, oh, so-and-so can't stand you. And I go, nah, they like me. And they're like, are you kidding me? And then they'll go, oh, did you know so-and-so likes you? And I go, who, what? You know, whew, I don't get it. How did Ben, as a little boy, speak with that social sophistication? Here's what we think. We think that Ben Franklin was sleeping with all those older, wealthy women in society in Boston as a little kid. Talk about colonial cougars. Wow. You know, I could see Ben on the strip in Fort Lauderdale. So that's Ben Franklin. So here's the other letter. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? Guests and fish smell after 3 days, right? A penny saved is a penny earned. He who lies down with dogs gets up with fleas, right? So Ben Franklin had all these great sayings. So people loved Ben. Poor Richard's Almanac, his paper, was the best-selling thing of its day and age. So a young man writes Ben a letter. Ben's up in years now and lived into his 80s, by the way, which is like the new 140. This young man writes to Ben and he says, Dr. Franklin, I'm worried. I'm getting married, but I have no experience. I have no idea what to do. So Ben writes back to this young man. He says, it's good that you're getting married, but he says, you need to get some experience. So Ben Franklin says, in the name of a good honeymoon, you need to get out there and get some experience. And may I make some recommendations to you? Ben says that as a man of science, having done considerable experimentation, he says, older women are the best. He says, the riper the fruit, the sweeter it is. So Ben tells this young guy, he says, go out and start sleeping with older women. They'll teach you a few things. And then he says, I've taken the liberty of preparing for you. He made like a David Letterman top 10 list. He put 8 reasons why you should sleep with older women. Would you like to hear them? Am I allowed? Okay, here we go. So I'm just quoting history. It's Ben Franklin, after all, the greatest American who's ever lived. So here's what Ben says. Unlike younger women, older women will be discreet and won't talk about it. And if you're a public man like me, you can't have this gossip out there. In 1998, when Bill Clinton was getting impeached for the Lewinsky scandal, I wrote an op-ed. I used to write a lot of op-eds for newspapers, saying that Bill Clinton should have read Ben Franklin. If Bill Clinton had slept with an older woman in Boca, she never would have told anyone and he would have been okay. But Monica, a community college flunky, of course she was going to talk about it. So shame on Bill. At any rate, secondly, Ben says, plus with older women, there's no hazard of them getting pregnant. Then he says, with an older woman, if the story does become public, Who the hell's going to believe it? He says some of them might be so desperate that you don't have to try hard and you might get dinner out of the arrangement too. I'm sorry for laughing. I think it's hilarious. At the end of the list, this is what Ben says at the end, the last two. He says, as a scientist, I realize that men age from the bottom up, whereas women age from the top down. So while the face may go, the vitals are working just fine. And number 8 on his list, this is what Ben said. In the dark of night, all cats are gray. Blow out the candle and knock yourself out. That's Ben Franklin. So there you go. So Thomas Jefferson had a scandal. I alluded to this last week, did I? I talked about Sally Hemings last week. I thought I did. Okay. So what I wanted to do was show you a picture of this one. This is Maria Causeway. Remember it said Jefferson had a mistress in Europe? He had several of them, actually. This is Maria Causeway.
Doing it for me.
I said she had married a British artist. He was Italian. His name was Richard Causeway, who was bisexual. This is the one Jefferson had the hot and steamy love affair with. I believe I said last week that the longest letter Jefferson wrote was a letter to her, which was a play between the head and the heart. Did I say that last week? I did not? Okay, good. I couldn't remember if I did or not. So anyways, Jefferson has this steamy affair. She's 23, 24. He's 37, 38. And they would go out on picnics and she would paint and he would compose poetry. They would play the viola and violin. I mean, they were remarkable together. I think it was their true love between the two of them. But she realizes Jefferson's not going to marry her. Jefferson never remarries. We believe that his wife on her deathbed made him promise that he would never remarry. There was one of the slaves was there, and the slave would later tell this to people who wrote it down. Some scholars dismiss this, saying it was just a slave. I think that's racist and condescending. Why would the guy make that up? He was there, so I believe him. Plus Jefferson's wife, if you remember from last week, she would have 2 other stepmothers who died, and her mother died, and the stepmothers didn't like her. So she probably didn't want that for her own daughters. So when Maria realizes Jefferson will never marry her, she leaves him and runs away and joins a convent. Talk about taking it hard from Jefferson. She left her husband, she joined a convent. Jefferson writes these letters. Gentlemen, you may want to take notes. These are pretty good. So here he goes. He walks to the port. He's grief-stricken. He says he cries and sobs. He never gets over it. When you come again, I will employ myself solely in finding or fancying that you have some faults. And I will draw a veil over all your good qualities if I can find one large enough. Oh, that's pretty nice. And then when he says goodbye to her as she goes to the port and sails away, he says, having performed the last sad office of handing you into your carriage and seeing the wheels get actually in motion to the port, I turned and walked more dead than alive. When wafting on the bosom of the ocean, I shall pray it to be calm and smooth as yours to me. Be our affections unchangeable, and if our little history is to last beyond the grave, be the longest chapter. And then he ends it in French, I will always love you. That's Jefferson. He writes a 10-page letter called The Head and the Heart with 2 characters. The head says you have to go back to Virginia. The heart says stay and run away with her. The head says you have daughters. The heart says this is the love of your life. And he goes on for 10 pages like that. Jefferson made a proposition I want to share with you to Maria when she gets on the ship. He said he's worried that such a beautiful young woman traveling by herself would be in the company of all these ruffians on the ship. So he says, I should travel with you. And he also says, worrying about your chastity, I should share the same bed with you. And she writes back saying, I would be better off with the sailors than with you. So then there was a famous book by Tristan Shandy, which was The Bomb. This was like 50 Shades back then. This was the 50 Shades of the Revolution, okay? And there's a story in the book where there's a man who wants to sleep with a woman. She says, you can share my bed, but nothing more than that. So she hangs literally a sheet in between them. So they're both in bed with a sheet hanging between them. But he gets scissors and cuts a hole in the sheet halfway down. So Jefferson says to Maria, he says, don't worry. If you let me share a bed with you, you can hang a sheet between us. And she says, knowing you, you'll bring scissors along, because they were both well read and they knew the reference. So that's where they were going with this. So Jefferson was writing sexy, penthouse magazine stuff back then. A Whore in the White House. I don't think I told you this one last week. Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson. Okay. So you're looking at Andrew Jackson late in life. Not as dashing as the paintings remember him. Fortunately, daguerreotypes, an early form of photography, came in at the time. That's Rachel Donaldson. Rachel's father, Colonel John Donaldson, he goes to from Virginia to Tennessee and settles Tennessee with 150 or so settlers. Literally hacks Knoxville and Nashville out of the woods, fights Indians, that sort of thing. So Rachel's the foremost debutante, if you will, back when that meant something, in Tennessee. She does what a proper girl ought not to do. She runs away and marries a much older man. His name is Louis Robards. And Robards turns out to be a ne'er-do-well, a drinker, loses his job. They have to move back in with her mother, which is what all new brides love to hear. Robards was emotionally abusive with her based on the letters. My guess would be physically abusive too. What happens is Rachel, for a second time, does what girls ought not to do back then. She leaves him. She leaves her husband and goes back home. Good for her. When she goes back home, there's an Indian raid on the community. It kills her brothers and her father and a lot of the men. So now Rachel and her mother, the widow Donaldson, are living in the biggest home by themselves in the middle of hostile Indian territory. So to make a living and for safety, the mother opens her home up to boarders. One of the boarders she lets stay for free is this guy, Andrew Jackson, who was a traveling judge and attorney. When Jackson's in your house, you don't need a pit bull or a home security system. Jackson was a madman. He was a mass murderer. You've heard of the Trail of Tears, everybody? The 1830 Indian Removal Act, that was Jackson. Jackson killed people in duels. He raped his slaves. He sold slaves' children. He was a very, very bad person, which is why his portrait is now hung up in the Oval Office. So Andrew Jackson meets Rachel, and the two of them fall head over heels. Rachel's mother encourages this because Jackson has a good career. And it's really a good relationship. Rachel soothes the beast in Jackson. They get married. First I should say, Rachel writes a letter to Louis Robards saying, divorce me. Women did not have the right to divorce back then. So she had to ask her husband. He agreed to divorce her. So these two get married. Here's what happens. He never divorced her. So Rachel's married to two men at the same time. They call her Lady Bigamist or the Whore of Tennessee. It's a giant scandal. Jackson runs for president. Rachel is begging him not to run for president. She doesn't want to go to the White House. It's going to be a giant scandal. It was back then called the Executive Mansion. She doesn't want to go because it's going to be a big scandal. Jackson wins the popular vote in 1824, but loses the Electoral College, if you could imagine such a thing, to Andrew Jackson. Rachel says, thank God, God has answered my prayers. 4 years later, Jackson wants a redo, and in 1828, he beats John Quincy Adams in both the popular and electoral. Rachel's devastated. Be careful what you wish for. She dies of a heart attack right after the election and right before the inauguration. Jackson attributes it to her worrying about the scandal. She's buried on Christmas Eve in the gown that she was going to wear to the inaugural. So Jackson goes to the inaugural by himself. Now here's the pickle. All of Jackson's critics were saying that we're going to have a whore in the White House. A whore will preside at the inaugural. Rachel's dead. So Jackson doesn't have a daughter, doesn't have a wife. He needs a presiding first lady or hostess. So what happens, well, there's a duel. Let me skip this for the sake of time. What happens is this. The woman on the right, a very attractive woman, doesn't she look remarkably contemporary? I think she does. This is from the 1820s. Her name was Peggy, Little Peg, they nicknamed her, Peggy O'Neill Timberlake. That was her name. Her father, John O'Neill, ran a boarding house / brothel. And it was the popular place where all members of Congress used to stay, including Andrew Jackson and this guy you're looking at, Senator John Eaton from Tennessee. Yes, I just said members of Congress used to stay at a whorehouse. It was a very popular whorehouse. They all did. So some things don't change, right? So what happens is Jackson doesn't have anybody to serve as first lady or preside at the inaugural and plan the menu, the venue, the seating, and so on. So he says that John Eaton, the man you're looking at, is going to be his war secretary, Secretary of War. Right before the inauguration, John Eaton scandalizes Washington by announcing he's going to marry Little Peg. It was said that Little Peg slept with half the cabinet and half the Congress. Her name was the politician's pet. She was the most famous whore in Washington. She would perform at O'Neill's Tavern. She would come down the steps with a boa singing songs a la Mae West. And I once told my students that, and not a single one of them had ever heard of Mae West. Not a single one of them had ever heard of a boa. So John Eaton marries Little Peg, the famous whore in Washington. Jackson announces that Little Peg will be the presiding hostess and the first lady of the White House. Didn't they say a whore was going to be first lady? Sure enough. The women of Washington boycott the inaugural. Why? Because all their husbands either slept with Peg or were lusting after Peg. We call this petticoat government. It took Jackson months before we could even have a cabinet meeting. None of the cabinet wives would let their husbands go to the cabinet meeting. The only ones that went were Eaton here, and one other cabinet member showed up at every meeting. Jackson blows a cork, fires everybody around him, if that sounds familiar. And Jackson is so angry, he replaces everybody but Eaton and that one other guy that went to the meetings. So after 2 terms, Jackson steps down. Could have easily had a 3rd term, but we didn't have the 22nd Amendment at the time. That doesn't come in until 1953. So Jackson, instead of taking a 3rd term, he says, I'm going to handpick my successor. And it's not going to be one of these people that hated on Little Peg. So he handpicks that one cabinet member, the only one that came to the meetings and was nice to Peg, a short New York politician named Marty Van Buren. Why was Van Buren the only cabinet member who went to the meetings? He was a widower. He didn't have a wife that told him he couldn't go. So here's the kicker. Van Buren becomes our 8th president in 1868, and he became president largely for this reason, because he was nice to a whore. That's why he became president. So fast forward, Little Peg's husband is a lot older than him, very South Florida. He dies long before her. So Peggy scandalizes Washington by sleeping with everybody and going to parties. She's now old enough to be a grandmother. An Italian ballet company was coming to Washington. And this was exciting because we didn't have ballet and we didn't have culture in Washington. It was a backwater at the time. And the lead ballerina, he was about a ballet dancer. He was about 21. His name was Antonio Buchanan. Don't tell me why I remember the name. Peg starts having an affair with this 21-year-old ballet dancer. She, like Cher, Demi Moore, and Madonna, she's old enough to be his mother or grandmother. Then she marries him. Peg goes away with Buchanan on their honeymoon. She wakes up and he's gone. He cleaned her out, goes back home, takes her bank account, all of her money, her clothing, and her granddaughter, and sails back to Italy. Peg is put in an old woman's home where she makes money by telling scandalous stories about all the foremost men in Washington that she slept with. She was like the DC madam. Remember the New Orleans madam? So here's the funny thing. So all the women of Washington hated Peg, but because she was married to a member of Congress, she was buried in the Congressional Cemetery. And one of the Washington papers in her obituary wrote the following: while the women of Washington may have hated her while she was alive, they are about to discover that she is now their neighbor forever. Grover Cleveland, I didn't tell you about this one last week, did I? I think I just mentioned it. I didn't talk about it, so I added to my slides. Let me do this and then one more. I'll end with some fun pictures for you. So Cleveland was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He was our 22nd and 24th president. 1880s and 1890s. He actually won re-election, but there was a snafu with the Electoral College, if you can imagine such a thing. So Cleveland enters the White House as a bachelor, and a scandalous guy too. Cleveland's best friend was a guy named Oscar Folsom. And Cleveland and Oscar Folsom had a law practice together in Buffalo. They went out drinking together. They caroused with the same woman together. Her name was Maria Halpin, possibly a prostitute from Pennsylvania. Here's the problem. Maria gets pregnant, and the three of them, no one knows who, whether it's Oscar Folsom or Grover Cleveland's son. She gives birth to a son, and she complicates it by naming the son Oscar Cleveland. So Folsom is married and has a daughter. Cleveland's a bachelor, so Cleveland accepts paternity, which back then meant that he paid to send the kid to an orphanage. The good old days weren't good, everybody. Here's a cartoon you're looking at from the 1800s. Cleveland's running for president, and there's Maria Halpin with the baby saying, "I want my paw." So people knew that the president had an affair with a prostitute and had a child out of wedlock, and they still elected him. So if some of you are trying to explain things today, maybe that helps. Wherever Cleveland would go, his Republican critics would yell, "Ma, Ma, where's my paw?" in the rhyme. What happened was Cleveland's Cleveland's Republican opponent, it turns out that he has more mistresses than Cleveland. So when Cleveland won, the Democrats finished the rhyme, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." So Cleveland's a bachelor president. What happens along the way is Oscar Folsom dies in a carriage wreck. Cleveland makes a lot of money and takes care of the widow and the little daughter. Her name was Frances. The widow, Folsom, makes Cleveland the godfather of the little daughter, Frances. He calls her Frankie. She calls him Uncle Cleve. He sends her to college. When she's away at college, when she's 21 years old, Cleveland's letters to her change and they become hot and steamy. He starts saying, "I have to have you." It's sexual. He's old enough to be her grandfather. He is her godfather, and he's the sitting president of the United States. So he proposes marriage to his 21-year-old goddaughter, which is really creepy. The widow takes her goddaughter, and they go on a cruise. It was not one of the ones I was lecturing on, but they go on a cruise, an ocean liner, and they sail. It's the day of sail. They sail across the sea. Cleveland misses her so much, he dispatches a presidential yacht filled with love letters. The love letters to the Frances leaked to the press. Talk about a scandal. But Cleveland gets off the hook because he never called Frances by her name. He used all those names that Karen and Richard and Andy and Wendy use and Rhonda uses. Honey bunches, sweetie pie, muffins, cupcakes, lovey-dovey. He used all those names. So the press thought Cleveland was trying to marry the widow, who was only so many years younger than him. So what happens when the widow and young Frances sail back to New York City, the paparazzi, just like today, are waiting in New York City to get the story. Cleveland sends his yacht out to intercept the ocean-going ship. In the middle of the night, like a Douglas Fairbanks pirate movie. I would have to tell my students Johnny Depp because they've never heard of Douglas Fairbanks. Frances climbs down the side of the ship, gets in the yacht. The ship goes to New York. The paparazzi jump the widow. Frances goes to the White House, and there's an artist's depiction. In a private ceremony, she gets married in the White House to her godfather. Talk about a scandal. It was a huge scandal. But the scandal dies down quickly. Here's why. Frances turns out to be a proto-Jackie Kennedy. Jackie was only 31, Frances was only 21, but she's a fashionista. Like Jackie, she was elegant, well-spoken. The public fell in love with Frances. They forgot about the scandal. Frances kicked off fashion trends. Ladies, if you were living in the 1880s or 1890s, I found letters, newspapers. Women would go to the boutique or the salon and they would say, "I want the a la Cleve for Mrs. Cleveland." And they would get the haircut. You remember how everybody had the Jackie Kennedy pillbox hat and the sleeveless dresses and those big sunglasses and all that. At any rate, she gave birth in the White House, and the press were so crazy about her baby Ruth that a candy company named the candy bar after the child. That's where it comes from. There they are, young Frances, a good-looking, smart, wonderful woman, and her grumpy, looks like Wilford Brimley, doesn't it? Harding, and there's his wife Florence, who was 5 years his senior, much more of his mother. They used to go on cruises, not my cruises, and here's what he would do. Harding and his wife would invite another couple, and when Harding's wife and the other couple's husband fell asleep, Harding would get the wife and they would crawl in one of the lifeboats and misbehave. So that was his thing. On the left, that's Carrie Phillips, who used to go on cruises with Harding. This doesn't happen on my cruises. Although my cruises are like Vegas, what happens stays on the cruises, right? So Harding was having an affair with Carrie Phillips on his cruises. And she threatens, in 1920, when he's running for president, she threatens to leak all of their love letters to the press. Why? She discovers this young woman here, Nan Britton. Harding's having an affair with a 21-year-old woman, so Carrie was mad because the woman is younger. Harding's letters, he dies in 1923, halfway through his presidential term, a major heart attack in San Francisco. A nephew went to court to get Harding's papers sealed. Some of the papers are still sealed. Others were released several years ago. I've read them, and I'll tell you what, I put cologne on and lit a candle when I read the letters. They were that good. I guess I can say this, Rhonda, since this is probably my last speech for the library. Harding and this young woman, Nan Britton, they liked theme sex. Harding would send her a train ticket to meet him in New York City, and he'd send her money. She would buy, let's say, an Indian costume for her and then a cowboy costume for him, or the schoolgirl costume for him and the school teacher costume for her, for him. So he would buy costumes and they would misbehave in New York City. She and Harding get caught in a closet in the White House. Harding's wife catches them. The Secret Service has to drag his wife away while they took Nan out. Nan Britton gets pregnant from Harding and has a daughter, Elizabeth, illegitimate child to the president. Let me end this because I'm way overdue. The president that wins my award for the worst dog in the history of the White House was JFK. You know, all presidential libraries have the social papers, which means they log in every visitor, they log in every phone call. And what we know is Marilyn Monroe would call the White House over and over and over. The records show that she would call it, let's say 10:08, then 10:10, then 10:12, then 10:16, which means Kennedy wasn't answering and she frantically kept calling. We also know that there were two secretaries, and I'm going to put secretaries in finger quotes because they couldn't type. Their code name was Fiddle and Faddle. Jackie loved to go out for lunch every day. She would take very long lunches at fancy boutiques with her friends. Kennedy preferred threesomes in the White House with Fiddle and Faddle. They would leave right before Jackie would come back. Jackie knew about this. What she would always do is she would call ahead and give an ETA on when she would arrive because she just didn't want to see it. In the Kennedy library, there's a letter from a maid. This is an interesting one. Kennedy and Jackie had separate bedrooms, as you would have guessed, for obvious reasons. There's a maid who told the story. She said she was in John's bedroom. Jackie walks, she's making the bed and changing the pillowcases. Jackie walks in because she goes to John's closet. She's picking out a suit for dinner that night. The maid says she pulled the pillowcase off and little panties fell out. The maid says she was mortified. Jackie, without missing a beat, according to the maid, says to the maid, "Get rid of those." And then she turns around and just starts picking out a suit like it was a Tuesday. So Kennedy misbehaved. Kennedy also wrote about his affairs. He liked to share these stories with friends of his from high school and college. I apologize, but I'm quoting verbatim. Here's one of Kennedy's letters. He told a friend, he said, "I went to Mexico for a senorita and a suck and a fuck." He said, "I came back with more than I bargained for, a venereal disease." So it's not a theory. Kennedy wrote it himself. So I put a list together of some of the mistresses that the Kennedy Library has agreed that he had affairs with, and here's some pictures. That's Mimi Fanenstock. That's her when she was sleeping with Kennedy on the left and her today on the right. There had always been a rumor that there was this college girl named Mimi who would travel in Air Force One and the presidential limo. And it was said that 2 Secret Service officers once found her naked there, and they gave her the jacket. So the lady on the right a couple years ago calls a press conference. And we always had heard stories about Mimi, but nobody knew whether it was real or not. And, you know, I never write on topics where I don't have primary source firsthand letters. You know, I could get 99 things right, everybody. And if I make one mistake, your reputation's toast. So I always err on that side. I need confirmation. So Mimi holds a press conference. Here's what she says. She walks to the microphone and she starts it by saying, "I am the Mimi." And then she told us all the stories that matched everything we knew. Here's what makes it really disturbing. She was Jackie's intern from Vassar. So Kennedy was sleeping with her. This is Florence Pritchett, a Palm Beach socialite. There's a young Jack Kennedy, fresh out of the Navy. Remember PT 109, he was a great hero in World War II, but broke his back, saving the lives of several of his men in a tragic boat wreck. That was one of Kennedy's mistresses, a Palm Beach socialite. This is Pamela Turner. She was Jackie's social secretary. So Kennedy was sleeping with his wife's secretary and intern. That's Pamela Turner, who would later write about it. Kim Novak. So Kennedy slept with all the A-list Hollywood actresses. No one in here is old enough to remember the 60s. So I'm going to tell you about them. This would be like today sleeping with Jennifer Aniston, J-Lo, Beyonce, and Angelina Jolie, I guess. All the A-list actresses. Kim Novak. Anybody remember Kim Novak? One of the Hollywood actresses. Very attractive. Janet Leigh, y'all remember her from Psycho, right? Norman Bates, Ninu. Kennedy was sleeping with Janet Leigh. Jane Mansfield, Kennedy was sleeping with both of her. Y'all remember Jane Mansfield, right? The pinup. Angie Dickinson, remember Policewoman? Before Angie Dickinson was an actress, she was a model. And Kennedy didn't wait long to misbehave. He slept with Angie Dickinson January 20th, 1961. That's the night of his inaugural ball. I always said Kennedy had a ball at his inaugural. Jackie wasn't feeling well. She went back to the White House early that night. At the last ball of the night, Kennedy and Angie Dickinson go up to the penthouse. Wow, talk about reckless. Olivia De Havilland, one of the most elegant, we just lost her this year, didn't we? One of the last connections to that, golden age of Hollywood. There's some evidence that Kennedy's father, Joe, was also sleeping with her. I haven't pursued it enough to weigh in one way or the other than to say Joe Kennedy would. I think John Kennedy was a good president. I think Joe Kennedy, his old man, was a scumbag. Harry Truman used to always say that he was one of the worst Americans living. At any rate, Peggy Cummins, if you remember her, Hollywood actress. Angela Green, remember her, everybody? Another A-list actress. Jean Tierney, I remember her. My dad liked old movies, and my grandparents, and I remember watching a lot of movies when I was a kid. I remember Jean Tierney. Blaze Starr, come on, you know her, right? The stripper. She was from Baltimore. She was a famous stripper and showgirl in New Orleans. She was sleeping with the Long brothers, the governor and the senator, and Earl and Huey. She also was sleeping with Kennedy when he would go to New Orleans. Blaze Starr, the stripper. Mary Pinchot Meyer, this is an interesting one. She was one of Kennedy's mistresses. She is out in a park in Washington and gets attacked by a mugger and gets killed. Her uncle was Ben Bradley, the Washington Post editor. You remember him? So Ben Bradley goes to Mary's apartment to clean out all of her possessions after she was killed. He finds her diary, which was filled with vivid play-by-play details of she and Kennedy's misbehavior. So we know what Kennedy liked, which I'll tell you at the end. Jory Malcolm, there's some rumors that Kennedy actually married her in Palm Beach, but his old man got it immediately annulled. This is codename Inga Binga, Inga Arvad, and Ellen Ramich. They're East German spies who Kennedy would meet in seedy hotels for a quickie. Think about it. They could have poisoned him or put a bug on him or something or compromised. I mean, this is shocking. Judith Exner, you probably remember her because of this guy. That's Sam Giancana. Remember him? He was the mob boss, the head of the mafia in Chicago. Well, this is crazy. His favorite mistress was Judith. Kennedy was sleeping with the favorite mistress of the mob boss. Talk about wanting to get whacked. Judith, after Kennedy's death, was interviewed by a reporter, and she spilled the beans about what Kennedy liked, which I'll save for the ending. Oh, we're at the ending. Okay, so there's my book and my shameless plug on cruises. Let me tell you the story, and then we'll take questions. Judith and others said that Kennedy was a very sloppy lover because his back had been broken and he was in such bad shape. They said that he would just lie on his back and tell the women to service him. And they said they felt used and dirty. And afterward, they all said we'd never do it again until he was on the prowl again. And they said he was so charismatic. And just when he was on the hunt, there was no saying no. We also know from Peter Lawford, you remember him? Part of that, the Brat Pack with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. By the way, Frank Sinatra was a horrible person. And Sammy Davis Jr., who was the good guy of the group. Peter Lawford was kind of their pimp. And he wrote in a book that was published posthumously. He and his fourth wife wrote it together. It was called The Peter Lawford Story. He wrote that whenever Kennedy would come and visit with Sinatra and the Brat Pack at one of Frank's places in LA, Vegas, Tahoe, Reno, wherever, that Peter Lawford was sent out to get showgirls. And he would get a whole bunch of showgirls, and then they would line them up naked. And then Kennedy, Frank, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis, and Peter Lawford would pick. Peter Lawford said Kennedy always had first pick, and then Frank, Sammy Davis had last pick. And he said Kennedy loved threesomes. He would always pick two. And then everybody would adjourn to the rooms in Frank's house. Then when they were done, they'd have their evening together. So at any rate, there's your R and X-rated Affairs of State, which is unlike any other book or lecture I give. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope this isn't my last lecture for Rhonda and the Friends of the Sterling Road Library.
No, not at all. Everybody seemed to love your presentation. In fact, I like one of the last comments that we had was, why couldn't I have had a history teacher like Dr. Watson? I would have been a history major.
Thank you.
So right now I'm going to just read some questions for you, Dr. Watson. Let's see here. Oh, one was asking if anyone in the White House had a homosexual affair, any of the presidents?
Yeah, one president, one first lady. The president was my second to bottom. There's only one president I dislike more, and I'll let you guess who it is. James Buchanan. He was our 15th president. I think he's the second worst president we've ever had. He served from 1857 to 61. Buchanan was gay. He did not have a same-sex relationship in the White House, but before the White House, when he was in Congress, he had a 10-year affair with another man, a senator named William Rufus King. It's reasonably well documented. Buchanan, there was an older society woman named Mrs. Roosevelt, and Buchanan, many years ago, I went through James Buchanan's letters. It's like a, 10-volume collection. It was literally the worst stuff I read in my entire life. I would take a bullet before I read it again. But I was looking for evidence on Buchanan, and I found it in these letters he wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt. He loved to gossip with her about, please don't misconstrue, by the way, I've been a lifelong advocate for same-sex equality, so please don't misconstrue, I'm also an unapologetic feminist. But Buchanan would, guys don't write like this. He would write to Mrs. Roosevelt, oh my gosh, I can't believe so-and-so gained 5 pounds. Did you see her hairdo? Her shoes didn't match her dress. He loved that kind of gossip. He also wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt a letter when his lover, William Rufus King, died. He said, I guess I'll be alone without ever again having male company. What if I actually find a woman? He said, well, if she cooked for me and took care of me, just as long as she never expected as much as a kiss in return. He also wrote Mrs. Roosevelt a letter after Rufus King died saying, I went out again wooing for gentlemen. Wooing would be like courting. In an informal sense, we would say dating or hooking up, maybe. Buchanan, the woman is my favorite first lady, and that would be Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor in 1933 and 34 had a 2-year physically intimate relationship with Lorena Hickok, AKA Hick. She was a lesbian journalist, and they had a 2-year affair. Eleanor broke it off because she was worried it would become public, and Lorena was falling for Eleanor. She bought Eleanor a ring with money she didn't have, so Eleanor said that's enough. Eleanor died in 1962, Lorena in 1969. When Lorena died, she gave 2 boxes of letters to the FDR library. One has been opened, the other one will be open soon. I read the letters in the one that was open. To quote, I just forgot her name, Doris Kearns Goodwin, for crying out loud. I like her. I met Doris Kearns Goodwin, had breakfast with her. She told me, she said, when I read the letters from Lorena Hickok, she said, I almost had to smoke a cigar. And then she said, but you know, sometimes a cigar is literally a cigar and sometimes it's not. So I was embarrassed and didn't know what to say to her. So I asked her to tell me a story about the Boston Red Sox, which is what Doris Kearns Goodwin loves to talk about. Does that make Eleanor a lesbian? This is going to sound strange, but I say no. I think Eleanor was really, really lonely. FDR had a lot of affairs. FDR's mother treated Eleanor like hell. Eleanor's own mother died. Her grandmother used to call her Granny, making fun of her. I think Eleanor was lonely. Eleanor at Valkill, you all have heard of Valkill. Eleanor actually, it was her house that she built. It became like a philosophical society. Eleanor invited a lot of female professors, which there weren't many at the time, and lesbians who were intellectuals there. It's the only place where they could really speak openly. I don't think Eleanor was a lesbian. I think she was an intellectual who couldn't find a place where men would take a woman seriously in the 1930s. So those are the 2 examples. Thanks for the question.
Okay, I'll ask one more question. I mean, I think everybody wants to have you on all night, but I know you've probably got to prepare for your next lecture. One of the people wrote, in the movie The Crown, I don't know if you've seen that, about Queen Elizabeth. They show LBJ reciting off-color limericks with Princess Margaret. Is that true?
There is some evidence that happened. Here's what I can say for sure. LBJ was always off color. LBJ liked to make rude jokes. At dinners, he would say something about a woman's chest that was sitting at the dinner, and Lady Bird was there. Nobody knew what to say because it was the president. We do have an account from one aide in the Johnson Library where he told one woman to come sit on his lap while her husband was there, while Lady Bird was there at a White House dinner, and LBJ is making remarks about her anatomy. Yeah, he was Donald Trump is not the only sexist, crude president we've had. LBJ was sexist and very crude as well. So was Warren Harding. So I'll leave you with one Harding. I told you about the theme sex. Here's a better one. Can you imagine something better than that on a Wednesday night? Harding, during Prohibition, Harding was a hypocrite. He and his cabinet pontificated, Republican family values and all that. They were drinkers, carousers, and liars, and they were horrible people. The Ohio gang, if anybody's read their history. So what they did during Prohibition, Harding and his aides would have, they would go to a speakeasy, like a place off an alley, and they would drink and have a big party. They would bring prostitutes and showgirls. There's a letter from one of Harding's aides that says the following, that he was talking about hiding a body. And here's what he implies. Apparently, one of the showgirls was doing a show for Harding. He was sitting at a table. She was standing on the table in front of him doing her thing. She gets to the end of the table, which meant it was off balance. The table flips. The back of the table hits her in the head and kills her. So the aide has to dump the body in an alley. They hustle Harding out of there. So, we've had a couple of really great presidents, and we've had some really bad presidents. We've had some wonderful first ladies, and we've had some really, really patient, if you know what I mean, first ladies. I think Jackie knew. I know Lady Bird Johnson knew. I think several of them knew. And I'll leave you with this. My God, I'm not justifying it. Please don't misconstrue. But I'm trying to get in the mind of Jackie, and I don't understand this. Trying to get in the mind of Jackie and some of these women. Jackie's father, Black Jack Bouvier, was just nonstop. I mean, he was a criminal too, nonstop with women. Her uncles were every relative. I think they grew up where this was just a daily thing, right? So their husbands were just the latest in a long line of really, really flawed and sexist men. So I don't know what that says, but I don't know how those first ladies dealt with all this. But they somehow managed to keep it together, raise children, keep families together, and all that. Marriage to me is a great mystery, as is love. I don't understand it, and I suspect I'm not the only person. So there it is for you. So,
well, thank you so much. We have so many positive comments. People really enjoyed the presentation, and I don't think it was too risque for our group, so don't worry about that.
I was debating with myself how far to go, but since I put some cologne on, I figured I'd have at it.
Just a reminder, on the Friends website, the recording of this presentation will be there, and as well as last week's, September 30th. Next Wednesday at 6:30, we have 100 Years of Women in Politics, and that should be an exciting presentation. I know Dr. Watson, somebody asked for more information about your cruise. We don't normally advertise in our programs, but maybe next week you could just talk about it a little bit.
I'll give you my email next week, and you can talk to me privately. I don't want to take the library's time. We'll devote it to Q&A, but you all can email me. It's easy. It's first letter, last name, R. Watson at Lynn, LYNN.edu. And then we'll just talk about it privately. Okay,
that sounds good. We loved it all. Thank you. Can't wait to see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Rhonda.
Hi there.
Oh, hi. That was great.
Good.
I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Boy, he's so animated. It was wonderful. I love his laugh.
Yeah, I was wondering, I thought maybe some people would be offended, but on the chat, no, people really loved it.
Yeah.
Rhonda, everyone can hear you right now, which is fine. But I think at a certain point we should end the meeting.
Oh,
okay. I'll go ahead and end it. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.